This is Pop Culture Yearbook. On this show, we pick pieces of pop culture that were important to us in a given year. We then discuss our memories and dig into those movies, albums, shows, and more. I'm Brad.
I'm Pete.
And I'm Graff.
All right, and so we hope you've been enjoying our 1993 revisit. Some of you might have heard those before, but if not, there's some Seinfeld, some great stuff in there. But we're coming back, and this episode you're about to listen to here is wonderful. So we had the opportunity to interview the editor and main writer of the book 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, Gary Graff. This is a guy who's written other books about musicians and been a music journalist for 30, 40 years. He's talked to people. He knows everything.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are a fan of
he's got 12 books.
Music, what?
He's got 12 books, he said, that he wrote. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there with him.
But if you are a fan of 90s music, as we know we are and many of our listeners would be, then enjoy it. It's a great interview. Now, I will point out we had a little bit of an issue with some sound at first. A few of his words cut out, but we fixed it. And then Gifford had a slight tinge of trouble towards the end. So we were aware of that. We couldn't do the interview over. You're not going to miss anything, but just please know we acknowledge it. And if you stick through it, you're going to hear a great interview with a great guy.
The important thing is me and Brad sound phenomenal. And that's what really makes the show.
We come through every time.
And you look marvelous. So that's good too.
Yeah. So anything you guys want to say quick before people listen to Gary?
I say let's go to Gary.
I just want to mention the book again, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, the music fans' definitive guide. Not the best albums, the essential albums.
Which he will explain many times.
Yes.
It is the best book, though, and it's an essential book for your collection.
Yes, it is.
All right. Enjoy the interview, and we will talk at you later. All right. So we are here. We're really excited about this one tonight. We all were reached recently with a question about an interview about this book called 501 Essential Albums of the 90s. And if there's anything that's right up our alley, it's music in the 90s in particular, as we were all growing up at that time. So we are here with Gary Graff. I'm very excited to have him. He's an editor and one of the main writers of this very large book with a lot of information in it. So we're really excited to have him here, and we just want to please introduce yourself, Gary, and a little bit about your background.
Well, thank you very much. Now that you've made me feel much older saying you were growing up in the 90s.
Well, high school and college. So
yeah, and I was in my third decade of doing music journalism. So excuse me while I pluck a few more gray hairs from.
Well, I'm right behind you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Gary Graff. I'm a music journalist based in Detroit. And as I alluded to, I've been doing this for quite a long time, since 1982 here in Detroit, and before that in college and even in high school when I was growing up with the music of the 70s. And I write for newspapers, magazines. I do radio and TV work, and I author books, of which 501 Essential Albums of the 90s is, I think, the 12th book I've done, and the fourth book with this particular publisher.
Okay.
So before we get into this book, I know you've written a couple others. Like one that I read that was seemingly very high praised was about Bruce Springsteen. Just wondering, like, how you pick your subjects and decide what it is you're going to focus on, and do you, like in that case, I guess, we don't have all the info in front of me, but like, did you actually talk to him personally? Do you know a lot of the artists when you write about them, or how does that look?
Sure. All the books, there is an element of my day-to-day journalism in them. So the Springsteen book you mentioned, which was Bruce Springsteen, A to E to Z. And this was also an encyclopedia type of book. And like in that book and books I've done about Neil Young and Bob Seger and Alice Cooper, these are artists I've interviewed time and again. So I don't necessarily speak to them specifically for the book. In fact, you try to keep these books kind of under the radar when you're doing them, especially if they're not authorized. It's better that they not know. Although in doing some of them, they eventually find out. And for instance, they were very helpful when I needed help, and the same with the Bob Seger books. So, and in terms of choosing subjects, usually either it's a pitch to the publisher or a collaboration with the publisher. So in the case of the 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, having a long-standing relationship with this particular publisher, not only in the books I've done for them, but in other books that I've contributed to. It's an ongoing dialogue. I mean, we do have a "Hi, how you doing today?" or I'm in Detroit and the publisher happens to be in Minneapolis. So the Lions beating the Vikings this season was, we have that kind of conversation too.
Pretty badly.
Yeah, pleasurable conversation on my part this year.
Well, it's not that pleasurable for some of us. I'll say
I was gonna say not so much on the Minneapolis end, but on my end. So this is just kind of this is the beginning of a series. We already have a 501 Essential Albums of the 80s book done, and it's coming out in May.
Oh,
and
awesome.
hopefully we'll be continuing into other decades. And that's just out of a conversation of people who are music aficionados, dare I say geeks.
Okay.
About music.
So it'll be kind of, sorry.
No.
It'll be kind of like an encyclopedia if you put a few of them together, and you'll have a whole group that you can just line them all up on your shelf, right?
Right. It'll be a series from whatever is the earliest decade we do to whatever is the latest decade we do. And I know we'll get into this later, but albums become a different prospect throughout different decades.
Mm-hmm.
They were considerably more important in the 90s than they are here in the 2020s.
For sure.
Brad, I just want to comment, Brad. I like your comment about the encyclopedia and lining them up, because it's like so many books are now electronic, but this book is a good looking book, and it's more fun to thumb through this book than, I don't know if it would be as enjoyable electronically. And this is a great one. It's a great looking one to have on your shelf, and that you can just grab and thumb through at any time.
Well, thank you. And I'll pass that along. I mean, one of the things I like about Quarto Motor Books is they do beautiful books, and have since I began working with them. So it's just a pleasure, when that envelope comes in the mail with the first book, with the first copy of the book, it's always a delight.
Excellent.
Say,
Gary,
one more question before you go.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, out of the other books you've written, do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite subject that you've written about?
No, music, writing about music. This book, the 90s book in this series, is a lot of fun because it's so encompassing and so wide-ranging, and also because I have a number of contributors working in the book as well, about 3 dozen for the 90s book, who are friends and colleagues, who I'm pleased to say are still apparently friends and colleagues after they saw how I edited what they wrote. But it's fun to have that relationship as part of a book. So I think in terms of putting something together, this was the most fun I've had doing a book. In terms of subject, no, if I'm going to commit to do it, it's going to be something I really have a calling to write about. And I'm happy to say that they've all felt that way.
Sure. So the collaboration is sure. And the collaboration for something like this is kind of what maybe sets it apart for you. Just the working with like you say, you had 37 contributors, including yourself, on this book. That's going to be a lot of fun to pick everybody's brain.
We had
when putting this together.
One of the things that was the most fun was a number of us, involved in the book, do day-to-day music journalism. And so we would have, especially when we were compiling the list, we would concert reviewing it. And before or in between the acts, we'd be having what I'll euphemistically call discussions about who should be in the book. And these discussions got so passionate that people around us were like gesturing to security, thinking we were all going to start swing at each other or something. and one of these contributors lives with me, so I got to know the most comfortable parts of my back patio to sleep on when there were specific disagreements about the book.
Sure. Well, and music is so individualized to people. It's a very passionate subject, so those discussions can get very heated.
That's
So
what
I
we aim for
completely
on this
understand.
show, by the way.
Well, good.
Yeah.
So we're going
heated
for that. We're looking
discussions,
for
yes.
that kind of debate.
Sure.
I
Right.
am curious, Gary, as you were growing up, maybe in your formative years, is there a particular musician or band that that really influenced you more than any other?
Maybe not more than any other, but interestingly, Steppenwolf. My favorite,
Okay.
because I was, as it turned out, fortunate enough to have a brother who and a hippie during the '60s.
Okay.
From a very young age, hearing all this great music that was coming out in the '60s, and my friend's favorite, whatever the newest cartoon theme was, or Disney songs, or whatever. And mine was Born to Be Wild when I was 7 years old.
Sure.
And I just think that crunch and that power, wasn't an accident that I then went on to gravitate to Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, and then progressive rock, and then start to broaden my taste from there. But I very vividly remember hearing Born to Be Wild on the radio, driving around with my older brother.
Sure.
All right. Awesome.
Well, and that kind of leads into, Pete kind of stole my question there a little bit, but
Sorry.
We're so connected.
every guest that we have on, we do always ask them their pop culture references. So with your wonderful answer on the music side, was there anything on, say, maybe television or movie side that you really gravitated towards as a younger man?
I was a very young Monty Python fan. My
Nice.
mother watched Masterpiece Theater on PBS,
Okay.
and the original Upstairs Downstairs, which was Downton Abbey before Downton Abbey, and I would watch that. But Monty Python came on afterwards, and
Wow.
and we were already in the groove because we had been watching a British show, so we could understand it.
Takes that minute to get the English
And
down.
And then my parents, God bless them, had already started taking me to like Mel Brooks movies. So
yes.
So Monty Python humor wasn't that far off the path
right.
there.
Excellent.
But we
Well, that's
would
great.
we would go to all the movies, and I watched Saturday morning cartoons. I grew up in Pittsburgh, which was Mr. Rogers' country.
Yep, you're right in his neighborhood.
Right.
Yeah.
I literally was in his neighborhood.
Is that right?
Wow.
He used to shop at my family's market when I was growing up. So
Wow.
that was a big influence, and that's what got me watching the local PBS.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's awesome.
Yeah.
and read plenty of trash. I mean, I got into the poppiest of the pop culture.
Okay.
Awesome. Well,
I
that's
do want
um,
to. Oh,
go
go ahead,
ahead.
Brad. No, I was
I was
just going
gonna
to head into my question. Did you have any more questions from your segment there, Brad?
Oh yeah, well, you've started to hit on it a little bit. I was asking about what the process is for this. You've described a little bit with all the contributors, but like, I guess I still wonder, how do you make the cuts? Like when you have those arguments, and you don't have the same number of albums in each year. So how do you decide how many go in a year, and how do you make the big tough cuts when they come down to it? That was my other question here.
Sure. So when we started, 501 sounds like a big number, and after we came up with a spread, it didn't seem like that many albums. Basically, it came down to me. I mean, you hate to come off as godlike, but it was that's what being the editor of the book is, right? I'm
Right.
the one who makes the final decisions, but based on these discussions or conversations we were having, and how much time I had to spend on the said back deck, on certain nights. But one of the things we did early on in the book, it was originally going to be the 501 best albums of the 90s, and we changed best to essential, which was, I think, a crucial change, because we thought about the albums differently then. If a lot of these would necessarily have been in their Savage Garden, In Sync, Britney's pick on that type of music. But but when you say essential, and if the mission of the book is to be able to hand somebody this book and say, here are the albums you need to listen to understand the 90s, then yes, you need to listen to Savage Garden and Britney Spears and Spice Girls and Backstreet Boys only once, maybe, if you've got taste, but you do need to listen to it to understand what was going on musically in that decade. So that was, and so really when I was making those final cuts, it was saying, okay, the album, or just that piece, that body of work, or just that artist, did it really define something about the decade?
That's pretty cool that you had a lot of responsibility and power then. That's can be a little dangerous too.
And what do they say about Ming the Magnificent? Brutal but fair.
Yeah.
Yep. For sure.
Um,
All right. So you did kind of allude to this already. You started talking about the essentials. You changed it from best to essentials. What would you say that you draw from to make your selection criteria? I want you to elaborate on a little bit on that. Not only because you said essential to understand the music, and I'm wondering too, it is kind of a two-part question. I'm wondering too, if you expand that out, it's not only about understanding the music in some cases, it's about understanding the entire culture of the 90s. For me anyway, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think it's really about understanding and measuring the impact of the album. And, that involves a number of factors, including how well did it sell, but also where did it move the music, and in some cases the culture? And that's a little bit
Yeah.
intangible, but it's the proverbial duck. You know it when you see it. So what Metallica's Black Album did. You know what Nirvana's Nevermind did. You know what Britney Spears, Oops, I Did It Again, did. And so and so a lot of it becomes a gut decision based on those kind of factors.
Well, I mean, and you touch on the fact that it expands out to other forms of pop culture. I think there's a lot of movies that are tied to some of these songs. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, like Friends, the TV show, very much included some of the music. And without some of that music, maybe it wouldn't have been the show that it is. We all think of course, "I'll Be There for You," which was the intro, but that's just a real quick example, but
I had the Friends
it
soundtrack.
expands to other forms of pop culture, and the country as a whole.
Oh yeah, we look at some, I mean, Footloose, The Breakfast Club,
Oh
of
yeah.
course, going back to the '70s, Saturday Night Fever, and the soundtrack, and then the symbiosis between the motion picture and the music became so tightly interwoven. And there were bands and careers that were made from a single song on the soundtrack of a hit film that got enough airplay to vault that band or that artist into a different kind of status, and also defined a period of a given decade. So that was that's a very important part of this. And just as much in the '80s book, we discovered we really had to include a number of those soundtracks in there.
Yeah, I counted 22 soundtracks out
Okay.
of this book here, and yeah, it's a great thing to include, like you say, because it does bring in another area of pop culture into the music realm.
Well, some of it influences not just music and movies and TV shows. Some of it impact the clothes that we wear. Look at Nirvana. It changed like who some people are. Yeah,
Crisscross.
crisscross. Yeah, people were wearing their clothes backwards all the time, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Nirvana did that. The Beastie Boys
Sure.
did that.
Oh,
A lot of rap acts did that. And then later in the decade, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, Britney, they all did that as well. So, and that all weaves into saying, okay, yeah, this is an essential piece of work if we're talking about this specific decade.
And if you want to talk about
Yeah.
U2, we could be talking about politics, world affairs,
Right.
like even bigger than, than just quote unquote pop culture stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely. U2, Dylan, he had some key albums in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
A number of artists. So it's all interwoven. One of the things I think we saw in the 90s, and this was part of a continuum, just was how interwoven music became in all aspects of life, primarily because it became so accessible and it was everywhere. Now that's we think about that today, it's even more so. There's music is there every single second of a day
Yes.
for some people, if especially those who are running around with their little palm-sized devices, or who have all their social media and notifications on. It's all music all the time, and we saw the 90s become even a greater continuum of that than the 80s and 70s had been.
Do you think, and one thing that I've brought up on the show before is that individualization of music that you listen to creates a little bit more division, whereas back in the 80s and 90s, we all heard the same music and it created more of a sense of almost community, where you don't necessarily get that anymore because nobody's listening to the radio for their music. They're just listening to their own thing. I don't know if you get that same sense of unity that you used to in a way.
You don't get that same consensus that we
Yeah.
used to have with all of pop culture. This isn't just music now, but we're
Right.
talking
Right.
TVs, movies, because there is so much of it. There was some study that came out recently, and you guys might have heard it too, but there's more music released in a single day this was in 2024, than there was in like a month during the 90s.
Mhm.
That's the onslaught. So you just can't build the same consensus we had around a Nevermind or an Appetite for Destruction, or certainly going back into the 80s, a Thriller or a Purple Rain.
Right.
It just doesn't happen anymore, which is really a shame. We see it a little bit now with a Taylor Swift. Okay,
Right.
that's a consensus kind of artist, and you see what happens. It's exciting.
Mhm.
People really feel involved. I think I really saw her impact when they had to cancel those concerts. I think was it in Austria,
Yeah.
in Vienna, and her fans just went and had thousands of them, had these dance parties in the streets instead of the
Mhm.
concerts. That's the kind of thing you could have seen happening with Michael Jackson in 1983. And it's fun to have that type of monolith be part of the
Right.
culture.
She
Right.
sort of broke that mold, and she was like the only person in history to have like all of the top 10 Billboard songs, but it's like because she was the one
Ascend.
artist that could transcend all of that
Mhm.
division that we're talking about, and because there's so much minutia down underneath. If you break through that, yeah, you're gonna get.
Right.
If you're the only artist that everybody can name unanimously, you're going to be the top 10. You're going to have everything in the top 10 like that. So
I don't know if I'd call it division as much as I'd call it lack of consensus or lack of unity.
Sure.
I mean, I don't think in fact, I think there was more division in the 90s, the various tribes kind of going at
Oh,
each other.
yeah.
Oh, your music sucks. No, your music sucks. I think there was more of that back then because there was more of a vehicle to have consensus or consensuses
Sure.
about different music. So you had the alt rock people, butted heads for a while with the rap crowd, and then the new country crowd, and that to me was a little more divisive than what you have now, is just people in their own pods.
Yeah, I totally
We're-
agree. Like, so I'm a teacher and I teach middle schoolers, and I mean they've got the AirPod in all day long, and they don't fight over music because they all listen to whatever. And so if they say, what are you listening to? Nobody even knows what they're listening to, so they're
They
not going
don't
to say, "Oh,
care.
that's crap." I wouldn't listen.
Yeah.
They don't even know what you're talking about, probably. Whereas that's really an interesting point about how back then there was more, because you had the East Coast, West Coast, and you had the different things, but everybody knew them. And now it's just,
Right.
this is the artist I like, and this is the artist I like, and who cares? I mean, nobody cares.
And this is the artist I like for this 10 minutes
Yeah,
before I like the next artist for the next 10 minutes.
Right.
Well, you remember too, being on the school bus,
Yeah.
you all had to fight and argue over one cassette tape that the bus driver could put in, and everybody had to listen to during the ride. And now
That
it's
tape
to
was Bon
that
Jovi.
point, you don't have to do that. Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
That's why I walked to school.
Right.
Gifford, I'm
Oh,
going
there
to
you-
transition into your question.
Sure. So again, as we said, you had quite a few contributors for this, but I was wondering, who listen to every album that is in this book to try to make your determinations? How many did you listen to, or is it just because of like you say, your decades in the music business, you're so familiar with them that you're like, yep, that one's good, yep, I want that one. And maybe it was more so when you started to parse down, like, I'll listen to this one again just to get another feel for it.
Yeah, in my case, I covered and listened to all these albums when they first came out, and I can say all of them when they came out. So I still remembered, obviously
Okay.
what they sounded like, but also, what their impact was at the time. Every now and then I'd throw something on, just to have it running in the background. And when I was writing an entry, I might throw that album on again in the background. I didn't really need to take notes about it or anything. Whereas I do know some of the contributors spent a lot of time listening or re-listening to their albums, and I think that's just individual writers with individual styles.
Okay.
That's just so much time and work. So we did a thing on our show a couple months ago where we did a bracket of my favorite 16 albums of 1996, and the amount of time that people had to put in just to listen to 16 albums was crazy.
Right. Yeah.
And you guys are covering 500 plus. I'm sure you cut out 500 more, and it's just the depth of knowledge that you all have is it's astonishing.
Now, and again, you have to remember, when you're doing that as a day-to-day job, it's what you do. So, and you better, if you're going to do it right, you better have that depth of knowledge, or we have no business doing this. No, some of the
Sure.
some of the people in the
can
book
I
are,
ask you?
go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead.
I was
Some of the
just going to
people in
say
the
some of the people in the book are not journalists. I have some musicians who are in the book, have some educators in the book. I have some friends who are just articulate music enthusiasts. So, they approached it in a different way, and a lot of the discussions with them was just, get the feel in here. We don't need a lot of reportage, but give me the feel. Why is this album essential to you?
I just want to throw out, if you're doing another one and you don't need to be a journalist and you just want somebody that loves music, I'll volunteer next time.
Okay, I'll remember it. No, I'll remember
I'll be on
it.
your panel.
Brad is your guy.
Yeah, out of the three of us, Brad.
As long as you can, and if you're an educator, I assume you can agree a subject and a predicate, and
Yeah.
And he's an English
I teach
teacher,
English.
so
all right, there you go.
I can put together a blurb.
I'm sorry, that's a dying art in the world now.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this or not, but what was the 502nd album? What was the last cut?
There wasn't one. We are dying on this hill. Okay, these are the 501.
Okay.
Okay, that's better than, and that's a lot better than saying I don't know.
Right.
But there were some. Obviously, there were some that hurt me personally to not include. Some of those who were my personal favorites. But again, I will die on the hill that these are them. And
Kind
this,
of
this
On the
is
bubble might be a better way to put it. Like who was
Yeah.
on the bubble?
we don't even
bubbles
talk. We don't even talk about it. There was no bubble.
There you go.
There was,
All right,
you know,
all right.
kind of following up on that. I guess I wonder too, and a lot of books do this, but why 501 and not just 500? Is that just, does that help like sell and get people's attention more, or
Sounds
why the
like
one?
more.
Yep, in our delightful internet age, search engine optimization, SEO likes odd numbers better
Okay.
than even
Oh.
numbers. So something like 501 shows up more than 500 would.
Okay.
Huh,
That's,
so
I kind of wondered
interesting.
about that.
And it gets people to ask that question and scratch the chin and ask the question, what was 502,
Yep.
or which
Well,
one
yeah,
is the
really,
Yeah.
because there's 501 instead of doing a 500. Now you know who that 501st artist is. Well, I guess
Right.
you don't really.
you don't really in the
Right.
way we did this book, but
right.
All right, and the next questions we're going to bring up just kind of our own personal noticings that we wanted to ask you about. You know, and
this is
some
what
might
this
be
is what I live for.
okay. So mine are some inclusions that I really liked, but some of the ones that were excluded, and just wondering if you have a quick, comment on if they were discussed or how much they were discussed. So I'm going to start in 1990, and the one that stood out to me the most was, unless I'm totally wrong here, the Black Crowes' "Shake Your Money Maker" wasn't in there. Their second album was later, so I'm wondering if you had any comment on the Black Crowes' debut.
That was one of the tough choices to make. You have, because you're limited in the choices and how many albums you can have, you're somewhat limited in how many you can have from any one artist. There are certain artists in the book who do have several in there: Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Oasis,
Yeah,
the Beastie Boys,
Garth Brooks.
some
RPM.
Garth Brooks, some of the rap acts who we felt as artists really defined the decade. And they were really in it for the long haul of the decade. But a group like the Black Crowes, Counting Crows would be another one with, again, just one album in there. They were one we definitely wanted to acknowledge them as a band. And I personally felt that the Southern Harmony Companion, I'm butchering the title now, even though it's one of my all-time favorite albums, that was a better and more essential album than Shake Your Moneymaker. Shake Your Moneymaker was a really great debut, and you knew the Black Crowes were a good band from that album. Southern Harmony was where they became, to me, the Black Crowes.
Okay,
That was
fair enough.
their sound.
All right. I'm not going through every year, but in 1991, this is the one where the most stood out to me that didn't make the cut. So you have Wildflowers in there later, but I was surprised to see the Tom Petty Into the Great Wide Open didn't make it. Any comment on that one, quick?
Yeah. And Tom, that I didn't feel like that's even an essential album in Tom Petty's discography, much less during the 90s. And I felt, and again, we're talking about another one who's one of my favorite artists of all time. And there are some key artists, rock artists like James Taylor, Jackson Browne. There's several others who don't have any in this book for the same rationale I just described. They recorded and released some fine albums, but they weren't even essential albums in their own catalog. Whereas Wildflowers was definitely essential to Tom Petty's catalog as well as to the decade. And I'm a guy who even liked Let Me Up, I've Had Enough, which a lot of people don't like, but that didn't make it either.
All right. One more that was kind of a bigger album, and then I'll have two kind of smaller ones. One of my personal favorites of that year, because that year had so many great albums. Like it's ridiculous. We've talked about 1991 100 times here. But one of my favorites was the Toad the Wet Sprocket, Fear. And I think you did have their second one in there. Was
We
that
went with Dulcinea.
was that the same thing as the Black Crowes, where you liked the second one better, or?
Yeah, very much so. I just felt like Dulcinea was and the contributor who wrote about it too felt that was the better album. That was a band where you could really hear the band becoming itself. That's not to say that Fear, was a bad album by any stretch of the imagination, but in terms of being essential and also being an essential part of that ethos within the 90s, that kind of semi-rootsy Americana, singer-songwriter-y, but more band-oriented type of thing that you had with Blues Travelers, Counting Crows, some of those bands. Really felt like Dulcinea was the one.
Okay. I have two more from 1991. Did the I'm sure you probably know it because you know everything here, I'm sure. But do you remember the album School of Fish, and was that even discussed by anybody potentially? It's one of my favorites of that time.
It's a good record, and it was popped in there, and I just didn't feel like it made the lasting impact to be considered essential.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have expected it to make it necessarily. I wanted to throw it in there and just see.
Yeah, good record. I talked to the band when it came out, I remember, and saw them live a couple times.
And then my last one from 1991, since you brought up a lot of soundtracks made it, one that I truly loving, and I got Gifford to like too, is The Commitments. I love that movie, love that soundtrack. I wonder if you have any comment on that one.
That was mostly just because it was cover songs.
Okay.
And it was a good film, and it was fun. Yeah. It was fun to watch, a band singing those songs, especially with the story and the context. But if I'm going to listen to those songs, I'm putting on the Stax Greatest Hits album, or a Motown record, or the original versions, not the covers.
All right, that's kind of what I thought there too. I'm going to jump ahead to 1995 now. I'll talk about one you did include. I guess you didn't write this one, but I love the Elastica album from 1995. Oh, yeah. So I was really excited when I saw that in there. Any discussion on that one?
Just a lot of, I think that's in there because that was a good example of empowerment. Girls can grunge too, and or do the alt rock thing. And I felt like Elastica, along with PJ Harvey, were those from Britain. Those were acts that really established a foothold for women within that movement.
Okay, and then right next to them in 1995 was the Everclear album, and then not only did I love Sparkle and Fade, but whoever wrote that one, I don't remember if you did, I didn't check recently, but whoever wrote that one mentioned songs from an American Movie, which is that's one of my all-time favorite albums. It came out in 2000, so we can't discuss it, I guess. Right. But we did an episode on that album, and so I love Everclear, and just your quick thoughts on them there.
Yeah, I'm a big Everclear fan, and I've gotten to know Art Alexakis a little bit over the years, and have had some nice interviews with him. And really a smart guy, a really good songwriter, and a real rock and roll guy. I mean, he gets up there and he goes for it. So it was obvious that was going to be in the 90s book. You may have just spoiler alerted a 2000s book, if we get to do it, because
I'd love to see that one in there.
Yeah, I think that's now I'm going to be held to it, but I do think, that would certainly be on my list.
Okay. In 1996, so I mentioned we did this big bracket, and most of the albums that we discussed were on there, like Counting Crows I don't think did make it, but Sheryl Crow and the Wallflowers and Wilco and REM, a couple smaller ones too made it. But we had a big surprise, and the group that we had that voted, we had a big surprise, and the album that won was not expected. It was Lyle Lovett's The Road to Ensenada.
Oh, wow.
And he didn't make it, but he did make it in 1992 for Joshua Judge's Roost. So I'm wondering if his Road to Ensenada came up, or you just have any comments on that, because that's one that a lot of us that loved when it came out and kind of forgot about it. And when we revisited it right now, we're just like, this is so good. And we loved it. And it kind of just snuck its way through our little bracket that we made.
Yeah, great album. He made a lot of great albums. He was one of those artists that, as we made the list, everything he released in the 90s was on the long list. But it was, it was just, we obviously couldn't have had all of them. Mm-hmm. And so we just, that was the one that we included. I remember feeling like this was where we really met Lyle Lovett, and this was where he really set the template for what he was going to do moving on. And it did mean we lost some very good albums in there, but I'm comfortable with that being the Lyle Lovett moment in the book.
All right, I just have one more band to bring up. So this is a personal favorite, and we're from Minnesota, and Pete's going to bring up some Minnesota connections here in a second. But neither Semisonic album from 96 or 98 made it, and I'm just wondering they had a huge hit, and I like the first one even better, the Great Divide. Wondering if they at least hopefully were considered for this.
Absolutely were considered, and I really felt like their impact was more about a song than the albums.
Right.
You
And
know,
see,
and
being from Minnesota, we of course got
oh
into
no, I
more
think
than
Semisonic's great, and Matt is one of the great songwriters of the last 30 years.
Mhm.
We've seen that in
Mhm.
what he's done with other artists. So that's it, but it just didn't quite make it up all the way up to the essential standard.
All right. So I just do want to say though, I Gifford's going to do even more of these, but before I turn it over to Pete, even with the exclusions, I kept turning to pages of this book, and I didn't want to stop because every time I turned a page, I'd find one that I loved and that I owned, and so it was just fun to look at and read it from another person's perspective. And then you just kind of explaining how you did that, that really, it makes me come to grips too with the ones that you
Uh,
missed that I wanted in there. So
Yeah, do keep in mind that the very first words in this book are this is a book that's
Yep.
designed to cause arguments.
Gifford was going to bring that up. It was his
Yeah.
choice.
Yes.
Yeah, Gifford came to fight, by the way. We'll just warn you.
I
did not.
We are. Listen, like at those concerts I talked about before, my fighting chops got really sharpened in the process of doing this.
So don't try it. Is
gonna-
that what you're saying? Yeah.
Before we go into Gifford's fighting, we're going to start off with a
No,
little Minnesota nice.
no fighting.
So
Yeah, Minnesota,
Gary,
see, that's a good
you
transition.
know. As you know, Gary, you're from the upper Midwest, like we are. So it's like if you were from New York or LA or somewhere like that, you wouldn't care because that's where everybody's from. But we take great pride as Minnesotans. We take great pride in the stuff that comes out of Minnesota, and really make a big deal out of it. So I do want to touch on a few of those that you had in the book that have Minnesota connections, and then a couple that didn't maybe make the cut. The first one is Janet Jackson, the Janet album, which was produced by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who of course have big Minnesota connections there. So anything you want to comment there?
Well, it was just an obvious choice. She's a little more prominent as you'd expect in the '80s book.
Sure.
Because of those, but she was still working with them first of all on the Janet album, and I really felt like her career, curtailed a little bit when she stopped working with them. They really knew how to not just make a sound
Right.
for her, but then to help her evolve. So that was the obvious choice.
Jimmy Jam, by the way, gave a shout out to myself and my wife. I'll say that
Nice.
because we were volunteers for the Super Bowl, and he personally pointed at us, representing all the volunteers, and said, "Hey, give a shout out to all the people in the blue jackets over there." And he pointed directly at us, and so I'll take that.
All
That's
right.
excellent.
I have that connection with Janet Jackson. I'll
That's-
say that.
Yeah, Jimmy's a great guy.
Well, I was the guy behind her on that one magazine cover, Pete. So take that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Can we see your hands to compare?
Yeah.
The next one, I was pleasantly surprised to see the Jayhawks Hollywood Town Hall.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is one of the first concerts. Gifford, you weren't there. Myself and Brad and a couple of other friends drove up. We made the 3.5-hour drive up to Minneapolis specifically to see the Jayhawks, who were opening, by the way, for Johnny Cash that night, and it was a great night. So, can you talk about the Jayhawks a little bit?
Love the Jayhawks.
I saw that same tour actually. They opened in Detroit for him, for Johnny Cash as well.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's Jayhawks, great band. Really one of the bands that defined that new alt country / Americana movement. And just Hollywood Town Hall to me was the one where, again, they became the Jayhawks on that album. The next album had the bigger hit, but I thought a Hollywood Town Hall was the stronger album.
I agree.
Top to bottom, it's a
It's-
fantastic album.
It's one of the best albums ever to put on in your car and just listen to all the way through while you're driving.
It's a good road. It is
Especially
a good
if
road
you're
trip, especially if you're on
Driving
the,
through the cornfields of Minnesota, like we
Yep.
did very often.
I was going to say, if you're on the plains, that's a good one.
Oh yeah, yeah. The next one, Soul Asylum, Grave Dancers Union, which included Runaway Train. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, there were a couple of Soul Asylum albums we considered, but, Grave Dancers Union was such a huge success that introduced the world to a really good band. So, how do you not put, when you think of, I think when you think of 90s, you think of that album, you think of Runaway Train. So that was the one.
All right. We've got two in there that I saw from Prince. We had Prince Love Symbol, which included the song Seven. Some people, it was huge at the time, really debatable whether it was his best song. I don't think it was. It's still a good kind of fun song. And then there was Diamonds and Pearls, which your wording was it included the wonderfully horny Get Off.
Yes. And that's exactly what it was. I remember seeing the video. I got an advanced look at the video and went and took a shower afterwards. But those were, Prince's for this kind of book project, Prince is one of those very problematic artists. He's one of a number of significant artists who were putting out significant albums with great frequency. As we get into the 80s and hopefully the 70s with this series, you have every freaking year, you have these great artists releasing great albums. So how do you pick? And in Prince's case, I felt like these were the two essentials. He put out a lot of music in the 90s. He started to go a little wayward in the 90s too, but these were the two that still had that Prince vision and that Prince consistency.
And the mass appeal too that he kind of lost.
Right.
Yeah.
These were the two
in the 80s, probably.
These were the two really accessible albums from the 90s.
Okay. One that got left off, and I totally get why it was left off. It wasn't nationally known. Like, we all love them here in Minnesota. But the Gear Daddies, are you familiar with the Gear Daddies, and were they considered?
I don't even know if they made the long list, which is really nothing against them, but it didn't have that impact I've been talking about. I agree. And I didn't feel like stylistically, sonically, or anything, it really defined a particular part of the decade.
Yeah, that's one we wouldn't expect to see it on there, but it really impacted us.
I had to give him a shout out.
Yeah, at the age we were when those two albums came out, like we all, and it brought it, even like Gifford has a little different taste in music. It brought us all together. So I'm glad Pete brought him up to give him some credit there. And Martin Zeller also went on to have some success in the 90s too. So I mean, he had a little bit of stuff out there after that.
Yeah, and I had to do that with the same, apply the same type of thought to a lot of albums from Detroit, and Detroit artists. We have some in there, but there were a number that were left out just because there isn't a Bob Seger record in this book. Now 80s and 70s will be a little bit different.
Right.
Wasn't an Iggy Pop, album in this book. So the one flyer I took from this area was a group called Big Chief and their album Mack Avenue Skull Game, which a lot of people might not have heard of, but that went on to be cited by a number of artists afterwards as a key influence.
All right.
Plus those guys have incriminating pictures of me, so
The last one I just wanted to bring up was, and this was more of an 80s band, but I think they had one album come out in 1990, would be The Replacements. And I totally get why they weren't called out in a 90s list. But Paul Westerberg is worth mentioning here too.
Yeah, I really considered especially his first solo album, which I really liked. But like I said, I just didn't feel like it made that essential grade and established itself. The 80s book you will be seeing replacements in.
Sure.
And his eventually from 96 was on our bracket.
That's
that's one we liked a lot here too.
Yeah, no, a tremendous songwriter, just never quite got the avenue to be as impactful as he should have been after the band. Still great to go back to those replacement records and listen to, now that they bring out the deluxe sets and all that, to throw them on, and it's great to listen to it.
Just lastly, an overarching comment, with your vast expertise in the music scene, any general comments about Minnesota or the Minnesota influence on the music scene?
I mean, we
Or that I
definitely,
missed?
yeah, we definitely felt that during the 80s. I think the city finally, there are all these, especially these Midwestern cities that, Detroit had more than Motown. And, Cleveland gets overlooked, Pittsburgh gets overlooked, St. Louis, and obviously, Minnesota as well. There are a lot of great artists. I think anywhere there's that there's A, industry, and B, cold climates to keep people indoors and creating, you get a lot of great creativity. So I think Minnesota, was really put on the map during the 80s, and that which was great, and hopefully people remember it as a key music area.
Sure. Awesome. Gifford, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Start some arguments now.
All right, here we go.
I'm not starting arguments. First of all, let me just tell you this. You grabbed me right away with Sex Packets, Digital Underground in 1990, Humpty Dance. I mean, that could be considered a theme song of mine.
His theme song.
I should introduce you to my neighbor across the street. He things that you can't unsee were him doing the Humpty Dance and knowing all the words.
Yes, well, yeah, and I've been seen a time or two doing the Humpty Dance and trying to say all the words. I think I know them, but usually when I'm doing the Humpty Dance, I don't have all my faculties at that moment. So that I just wanted to mention that right off the bat, that was absolutely awesome. And when throughout the years of doing this show, when we kick off a month, we start a new year, and we'll go through and write down all our favorite movies from the month and TV shows and music for that particular year that we're doing. So, of course, we've covered just about every year in the 90s already in our first 4 years. So I went back through my notes. Most everything that I had in my notes tied to this book. Like, you guys hit so many obviously huge albums. They're the essential albums of the 90s, but there wasn't a whole lot to really pick at. So I don't have that much, but I did just want to bring up a couple here. So first off,
I thought for the butt here.
First off, I thought it was funny how many exclusions Brad had for 1991, considering 91 had the most albums included in it in this book with 67 albums.
Yeah. That only speaks to what Brad was saying about the year, what kind of year that was.
Oh,
it's so great. I mean, obviously there's some great stuff in there, and I love that you had Mark Cohen in there, Walking in Memphis. Love that song. Just love it. The only thing I could really come up with that I found that I really enjoyed from that year that you guys didn't include in these 67 albums was Joyride by Roxette. I didn't know if that was something that you guys considered at all.
It was one that I might have spent some time out on the aforementioned back patio sleeping. Although Stacy, my partner here, also wrote the Mark Cohen, so I could say that she got that instead of Roxette.
Okay.
There was some lobbying for Roxette, but again, one that I felt was more impactful as a song, even though they had more than one hit. I just I don't know, just didn't hit me at the time, or even 30 odd years later, did not hit me as something that was essential to understanding the decade.
And I completely agree with you. I'm literally nitpicking at this point because, again, 67 albums in that year, and you guys nailed, I would say, pretty much all of them. I'm not even going to mention.
Since you brought up Mark Cohen, I did want to say that was one that I owned and loved, even as a high schooler, which maybe you wouldn't think, he was so adult and everything. But I was happy to see that's another one that when I turned the page, I'm like, oh, there's Mark Cohen. That's cool. So glad you got to mention.
Right. Well, and like you say, I mean, they had, Roxette had a big, hit or whatever. but probably not something that's going to really move the meter. But I did enjoy that there were, in my opinion, some albums that were included, like Hanson Brothers with Mba.
Yep.
Like that is, seismic, it's so catchy. Every time you hear it, it gets caught in your head. So I love that was included in the book. One that I had for 92, and again, I'm going to lean a little more country in the beginning part of the decade. Just wondering if Sawyer Brown ever crossed your guys's mind as far as the Dirt Road for 92.
Yeah, they were I just didn't feel like that made an impact. One of the things with the genres too, and we have gospel in there and we have jazz and techno, of course. I really felt like, to be essential, they had to have some reach beyond their genre. They, in other words, Garth Brooks or Alan Jackson or Tim McGraw. And I really didn't feel like, I felt like Sawyer Brown kind of stayed a country band and just a country band. Good band, nice guys, but
that is totally fair. And again, these are my personal choices.
Yeah.
So
Gifford is a country boy.
I am a country boy, and turn the
Thank
page
God.
93. Love to see Clint Black kill in 93. Love that album. That is one that that CD is almost been overused in my collection. So extremely happy to see it included in 93. But in 93, we didn't have Toby Keith's or Faith Hill's debut albums. And I know we got Faith Hill in later and we got Toby Keith in. And I'm assuming the reason would be is you'd say, well, that might not be the essential portion of their library. Would that be fair?
Yeah, those early albums, were not, those were artists that really developed where, and you'll see this in the 80s book, that famous class of 89, Garth and Alan Jackson and Clint Black. There were a couple others who came out fully formed. They came out of the box, fully formed, and made albums that were great albums by any measure, not just, oh, that's a great album for your first album. These were great albums. I didn't feel like that was the case with these two that you mentioned. Sure.
The one that maybe hurt me the most, just because it is one of my favorites, was the Brooks Hardworking Man. I know Brand New Man was included, I think the 2 years before. But to me, that one might be, in my opinion, the better one of the two. But still, love that Brooks and Dunn was included earlier in the book. In 94, I think the big one for me here was that Black Hawk self-titled debut album was not included. That had some massive hits. Goodbye Says It All, Every Once in a While, That's Just About Right. That seemed to have a lot of play, across the board. But again, I'm not sure if that one even entered the conversation.
It did. It was considered, and what I would say on that one is, okay, those were all good and they were big at the time, but when was the last time in the last 20 years you heard them?
Yeah.
So that's
a band I had
that's really a good point
about until you brought it up there, Gifford. So that's a good point.
Yeah. I think, let me see, 95. So 95 was the year that had the least amount of albums in the book, at 41. I think a couple, the big one for me, I got a couple in here, would probably be Coolio's Gangster's Paradise. When he just that's that one.
Yeah, it's one that's fair enough. I mean, sure, that was one that was considered, talked about, ultimately just, okay, we don't have to have that one in the book.
Okay. How about Collective Souls, the Blue Album? It's a self-titled, but a lot of times just called the Blue Album.
That was another tough choice too. That's one I happen to like a lot, and I liked their debut album as well. But felt like, Collective Soul, and listen, there's no Creed album in this book either, and just felt like
that's true.
Those were good bands, kind of at the time, but not necessarily essential bands, which, now that Creed has come back this year and is doing, huge box office and everything. You know, we can debate that, but I'll stand by the decision. I mean,
Sure.
Creed was the Nickelback of the '90s,
Yep.
and but I think that was not necessarily a wrong opinion either.
Sure.
You're saying Collective Soul bred Creed, which bred.
I don't think I don't think Collective Soul bred Creed, but
No, I don't either. I just
and those Collective Soul. Collective Soul, I think to me was more of a singles band than an album band, and their singles are magnificent. They
Very
really are. But never quite gelled on. None of those albums felt like they were essential.
touche, gel.
For 96, loved Deanna Carter being
Hey,
included in.
Gifford, you left one out from '95 that you were going to bring
Uh-oh.
up.
Oh, which one did I? Hold on.
Chris Isaac.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I forgot about Chris Isaac. We covered that on our show. Brad is a massive Chris Isaac fan, as are Pete and I. But after we did that show and listened to that album, we, of course, fell in love with it. Any thoughts on
Forever Blue.
Forever Blue?
Yeah, great,
from
great,
Chris Isaac.
great artist, great album. One of my favorite live performers.
Yes. Perfect.
Just what it wasn't quite 501.
Sure.
But we'll put him at 502 then.
If
There
you
you
want,
go.
if you want,
There you go.
if
We
you
got
want to. I think the magic of this is everyone's going to have their own 502.
Exactly.
So in 96, again, this would be more just the song than maybe the entire album, but Blackstreet's Another Level with No Diggity was absolutely massive
Yep.
for me. I didn't know if that one happened to break into the conversation, or Tony Braxton's Secrets. I thought was also a pretty big album from that year.
Yeah, good albums that were part of a movement but didn't launch the movement. So they weren't Guy, they weren't Belle Biv DeVoe, so those kind of followed the movement but didn't launch the movement.
Well, and in the middle part of the decade here is from 95 and 96, we've got 41 albums and 44 albums in there. So these would be the years where we got some of the lower amounts for the year. Actually, 98 would be the least at 39. But we talked about sound, where a lot of those were chosen because of their impact. And so I probably answered my own question here, but that Swingers soundtrack, that was an absolutely huge one from 96. And maybe it's because Swingers itself wasn't a huge box office draw, more of a cult classic. As
you did have the swing movement was massive.
You did. And, we have Squirrel Nut Zippers in there. I think we've got a couple of the others in the book. And that was just, I didn't feel like that was a soundtrack that had that kind of impact or staying power that some of the ones
like the Titanic.
It wasn't necessarily original songs on it either. There was a lot of
Big Bad Voodoo Daddy had a lot of them on there, but there was a lot of standards and other things too.
Right. I don't have very many more here. Nimrod from Green Day in 97. Obviously we had Dookie in this book, and rightfully so. Any thought on that one?
Yeah, just another one that's a good album, not an essential album. That a Dookie, and when you set a standard like Dookie, and then that let's say American Idiot did after that, the ones that fell in between, really don't measure up. So some of these bands were their own worst enemy in that regard. And Tom Petty, when we were talking about earlier, when you set a standard like Damn the Torpedoes, and then and then go to Full Moon Fever, and and then the Wildflowers, some of the ones that are in between, they just don't meet up to the same standard.
Mm-hmm. In 98, I believe you've had Bare Naked Ladies in here twice now, which
Two books. Two.
Which,
we have
which I love that you included them in here.
Yeah, they're just a great, really,
Yep.
really
So that
original
was an
band.
excellent inclusion. Mhm. How about Lenny Kravitz's Five? That was one that I saw as an exclusion in there.
Yeah, I think, don't we have,
Other woman was on that album.
I think
Um,
we have, or was it Are You Gonna Go My Way? Or we have, pretty sure we have one of them. I have to look in the, it's funny,
you do?
when
Okay.
yeah, it's funny when, so we did we did this in the 80s back to back. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but I can't tell you how much things are blurring. Uh, we know
Oh
that.
yeah, we got Lenny Kravitz. Yeah.
Yeah, we have Let Love Rule in there.
Oh, yeah,
And that to me was the album,
Yep.
and what he's done since follows a template that he established.
Sure. Well, and then for 99, I think maybe I'm just trying to get an extra one in here with Foo Fighters. There's Nothing Left to Lose, just because I'd like to have more Foo Fighters
Yeah.
in there. But probably the same thing with having, you've included them. Those albums are a little bit more definitive for them, but I think it's worth a mention. One of the questions I did have for you is, again, beautiful book. I mean, it is absolutely gorgeous the way this book is laid out. Is it based on cultural impact, who you decide gets like a full page or like a full 2 pages, as far as how they're displayed, as opposed to some pages have 3 artists on it and a little bit less of writing with that? Just kind of curious how the layout of the book came to be.
Yes, I think you can see in the ones we chose for the big takeouts. Some are 2-page spreads, some are the same length, but just have the 1 page. Those are the albums that we felt were the most impactful, and the ones that had the most to be written about them. I mean, the hardest ones to write were the short ones. To try to write about why an album's essential in 90 words is very difficult. In terms of the 2-page versus 1 page, that was totally up to the design staff, and I think it was just when they collect the images, they go with what they feel are the best images.
Just great photography too on some of
Oh,
them.
yeah.
Like I love this
Beautiful.
photo of Johnny Cash that is, I guess, on page 251, and then a few of the other ones. I'm sure that had something to do with it too.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Like I say, the quality of the image, and also exclusivity. If they find an image that hasn't been very widely seen, you go with that.
Yeah.
This is the area that's a little above my pay grade. I get to review it when they're done, but they go and take it and they do their weird science of design where they are, and then, as you say, they do a great job of it. So I try not to interfere too much.
Right, Gifford, are you done grilling him now? And
Yeah, I
keep it coming,
Gary,
Ryan.
I apologize.
Don't apologize.
I took it awfully hard on you, but I will say what I love that, like you brought up the first sentence of the book. This is a book that's designed to start arguments, and it absolutely is, because, again, as we said, music is so personal to everybody, and it is just a wonderful book that has so eclectic. It's got everything in there.
well, and I like hearing the descriptions of these too. Like, you have certain artists that kind of are bigger and transcend, and they might have multiple albums, and you have artists that were impactful but don't really deserve more than one album on the list. And just the way you describe that makes a lot of sense. And whether we agree with it or not, it's cool to hear that process.
Yeah, it is fun. Like I say, it's as we got into the 80s, and as we'll get into the 70s, it's going to be that much more difficult. I mean, you think about all the Black Sabbath, all the Yes, all the Genesis, all the Led Zeppelin actually did us a favor and took a few years between albums, which not many artists were doing. And Fleetwood Mac, and the Eagles did that, but they were just in the 80s. You had all the REM and all the Prince and
Every year with our
all the U2, and like that's it. It was every year, and they were great albums. So it's quite a bloodletting until you get to that final list.
Yeah.
we got a couple more questions here for you, if that's
Sure.
okay.
Sure.
So one thing that I noticed too is that, and this, it makes sense because of my age and everything, but as the decade went on, I kind of knew less or fewer and fewer albums that were in the later years. Like I would know a lot of them, but maybe I didn't know them as well, or I didn't personally listen to them. So like 91 to 96 was really, huge with me, all those. Do you have like a favorite year in the 90s, or a time span that stood out to you where you feel like this is the peak, this is where I really think, I got the most out of this? Was there a time like that for you?
Not really, for a number of reasons too. One was, I'm covering it and covering it on a continuum. So there's this constant barrage of really good music coming out. You guys mentioned a number of the albums that aren't even in the book, but they were being covered and they were significant at that time. So was doing that, and I was also raising children at the time. So there's nothing that will blur your sense of time and perspective like raising children and chasing them around. So
We can all speak to that.
God
Yeah.
bless Brad. God bless Brad for spending every weekday with them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
We all say that every day. God bless Brad.
Oh,
Yes, and we call him Mr. Sorensen too, just so he feels comfortable.
There you go. I mean, my two oldest would have been in middle school at the time, so I know what the red zone is when we're talking, or as Kenny Loggins would say, the danger zone. I know what that is, but yeah, I didn't. They, like I say, I view it as in this kind of continuum with peaks. So obviously you felt the grunge thing happening in 92. You felt the pop thing happening around 98. You felt those kind of swells. You felt the country in the early 90s, and that swelling as a format. So you could feel that, but those are more, like I say, that's more episodic in my world than it is definitive of a particular point in time.
As you're going through this book, was there anything that came up as a surprise to you that maybe you wouldn't have thought in the 90s, as it was happening, but sort of resurfaced that you might not have expected when you're putting the book together? Anything that jumped out like that?
You mean things that stood the test of time that I wouldn't have expected to?
Yeah,
Or things that you maybe kind of
you didn't
forgot
like
a
in the
little,
90s.
like when we did that thing with Lyle Lovett and how we all rediscovered it, like that too would be anything like that.
I think from having what I was talking about before, just being in it on a day-to-day basis at the time, it wasn't that I was necessarily deciding or expecting at the time, oh, this is 30 years from now, I'm going to put these in a book. But I had a sense of their importance. So there was nothing there on the longer list, the 2,300 on the original spreadsheet. There were a few things that were surprises that we'd consider, but then as we saw them disappear, maybe they weren't so surprising.
Sure. Okay. All right. Gifford, over to you.
Well, you kind of mentioned it a little bit. You've got the 80s. You're thinking about you're working on that right now with a 501 Essential.
Yeah, 80s is done. It's coming out in May.
It is done. Okay.
Yeah.
So with that, we'll step back a decade into the wonderful 80s. What else is on the horizon for you?
Hopefully, a next book in this series. I'd like it to be the 70s. I think that's the natural, for a lot of reasons, that's the natural direction to go in. At some point, we will move forward into the 2000s, but I think that needs a little more time to marinate before it's time to put out a 2000s book. And the 70s was such a great age for the album And I'd like to see us get in the 60s, into the 60s. That's about as early as we go. The 50s had some albums, but wasn't really an album decade. So
To
I'm
get to
hoping
500 albums, yeah, that would be tough.
that would be a
in the
little bit
50s.
of a challenge for essential
Yeah.
albums. I know some people are wondering if, the first 4 years of the 60s, 60 to 63, will have enough albums, but they will. Just different kind of albums. We tend to think, even if you're including all the different genres like we have in this book, you do tend to think of enduring albums in terms of classic rock albums.
Right.
So certainly in the 60s, 60 to 63, there weren't so many of those, but you had tremendous jazz albums. You had important Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Ella Fitzgerald albums. You had Broadway cast show albums. You had soundtrack. You had instrumental soundtrack scores, film scores. So yeah, there will be enough to. They won't be as long as some of the other chapters, but there will be enough to get us up to the Beatles, and then and then go from there. So that in terms of book projects, there's some talks about other biographies coming up as well, and those get batted around. The process a book goes through before it gets greenlit is, it's quite involved, and there's a lot of hand wringing and head banging against the walling and things like that. And then beyond that is just, still doing the day-to-day journalism and keeping up with all this crazy music that's coming out, and okay, what's a TikTok 5 minute sensation, and what's some trying to find things that are that are of real artistic merit and will have value even at this point, even 6 months from now, much less 30 years.
Yeah.
And where can our listeners read you, like you say, on a daily, or with your current stuff that's coming out?
I post most things to my socials. So on Facebook, it's Gary Graff on Music. On X, it's Graff on Music. On Instagram, it's Real Graff on Music. And on Blue Sky, it's Graff on Music.
Okay.
And that's Graff. If you
Two
are-
F's, correct. Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to the '80s book.
That's going to be a fun one.
Hooked.
We might have to have you back.
I'd be more than happy to.
Maybe.
Again, another book.
Gifford, do you want to be a little nicer to him next time?
No.
I'll try.
But Gary, you always have the freedom to tell him, write your own damn book.
Oh, listen,
You don't like it, write your own damn book.
I wasn't joking when I wrote those first words that this is designed to cause arguments. And I've been enjoying the promotional process of the book, but if I have any complaint about it, it's that everybody goes too easy on me.
Right.
And I want to fight. I mean, music, as you guys can attest, I can tell, music aficionados, dare I say geeks, like nothing better than a good argument.
Yes.
That's true.
And so, we should go at it. And, that's if you love something, you're going to defend it, and you're going to go to the mat for it, and you're going to tell everybody else you're the right one, and nobody else, and everybody else is wrong.
That's the beauty of opinions.
It is.
Yeah,
If there weren't opinions, I would not have a career.
Yeah, exactly. Well, good. Well, I absolutely enjoyed it, and thanks again for sending the book along to us in advance. 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, the Music Fans Definitive Guide. Excellent read.
Yes, it's well worth your time. And if you like music, it's something you can just page through so easily, and you can go back and forth. And it's just, I love that kind of book. And it's kind of like when people read stuff online and they don't have attention spans. This appeals to if you love the music and want to read about it, it's good. But if you have a short attention span, it's a perfect book for you that way too, because it's just little short things, one onto the next one. So
that's such a nice way. That's such a nice way of saying it's a good bathroom book.
Well, I wasn't thinking that, but there's nothing wrong with the bathroom book.
There is.
Also, I think Gifford can finish the entire book.
Thanks, Pete.
I think it's a good display book, is what it is.
Yes,
It's a
good coffee
conversation.
table.
Yeah, it works.
Yep.
It works as a doorstop.
Or a table leveler.
Yep.
Perfect.
Just
All right, well,
buy the book.
thank you.
Gary doesn't care.
Yeah.
Thank you
That's
so
it.
much.
I don't care how
taking
you.
the
I don't
time.
care how you use it.
Thank you so much
All
for
right. Well,
taking.
thank
the
you
time
very
to
much,
come.
Gary.
Thank you
Hopefully
guys. I really
we'll,
appreciate
get
it.
a
Been a
couple
pleasure.
people to go find this book and read it for you, and maybe they'll email you and start a fight with you if that's what you'll.
I'm in Detroit. We fight in Detroit.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
So thank you. We're gonna just stick around if you want for a second there, Gary.
Sure.
All right, guys, that was great. So we've done some of these interviews, and we've always, I think we do a nice job, and we've always found some
Damn
really
right we do.
really interesting people to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
You can look back in our catalog, and like we talked to the, Married with Children writer, and we talked to writer of an NBC book about the Tonight Show, and we've talked to Fritz and Wheezy from LA. There's some fabulous stories in there, and it's pretty cool that these people reach out to our little show and come on. So I think this was another great one. I loved Gary. What'd you guys think?
I thought he was fantastic. I know I'm going to reach out to Raul Malo too to see if he wants to come on.
Of the
but I,
Mavericks, by the way, that was the discussion afterwards. So for the audience, they might be a little confused by that.
Right.
well, I mean, if they listened, yeah. But it was okay. Sorry.
Yeah, it was
So
after
Raul Malo of the Mavericks, the country band that we like, Gary said we should get him on our show. So
He
we're gonna.
said he's very responsive and a super nice guy. So Raul, if you're listening, come on our show. Anyway, yeah, no, I thought he was fantastic. The book, more importantly, the book is just amazing. It stirs up great discussion and is quite frankly one thing that we are lacking in today's society is healthy, friendly debate. So I loved it. Gifford.
Yeah. You can never go wrong with having smart people on your show. He just knows so much, and
it's experience.
just right. A lot of experience. And I know for our listener out there, it's a change of pace to have somebody smart on. Considering you've been listening to the three of us,
we like to step outside the box. Right. We try to think outside the box, but it doesn't work out when we try to think.
No, it doesn't. And then we bring a guy on like Gary, who just does such a wonderful job with this book. Again, the book visually is awesome. Can't recommend more. You guys go out and get this book. It's a fun and it's very quick read. Visually, it's wonderful. So throw it on a coffee table. It's a great conversation starter. But yeah, it's just nice to have, smart people on that know their business and put together just a wonderful book and have them on and talk about it. So
not only visually, but I have the book right here, and it's even cool, like the feel of the book, because it feels like a little record.
A record.
It's textured, and it's done pretty sweet that way too.
But really, like you were saying, it's an honor. Like we put together this show, and it's like, we do what we can, and we try to reach people, and we don't know truly how many are out there to pay attention. But to have somebody like that come on and spend his time here, and to get to learn from them, it's just fantastic. And so it's probably one of the coolest things about doing this little thing we do on the side here.
It is. So thank you, Gary, again for coming on.
And
yeah, just a great time
for the 80s.
Right. Yeah. We'll have to check into that because he said that's coming out later this year. So that'll be awesome.
So like we said at the beginning, speaking of the 90s, hopefully you're enjoying our 1993 episodes right now. This will come out in the middle of those. But we are coming back in full force for our 5th season in February. And so we will be starting that off by going over some things that we truly love, kind of in honor of Valentine's Day. We're each going to surprise each other with a little Valentine's Day present of something that we love that we haven't yet discussed on the show, and we're going to kick off our year like that. And we'll be back every Monday at that point with new stuff for you. But in the meantime, hopefully this little interview whet your appetite as well.
Your appetite for destruction, maybe?
Yeah, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Valentine's Day, Gifford, I'm wondering what band makes you wonderfully horny.
I think that would be Preacher Row.
Of course, it's Preacher Row.
Of course they do. All right,
All right.
so we hope you enjoyed the interview. Let us know. Go on the socials and let us know what you thought of Gary. Interact with him. Let's hear some of the debate. What do you think about the albums that we brought up? And please interact with us, and we will see you in. Well, we're coming out Monday, but we'll see you in February with some new stuff. Hot off the press.
What is your 502? That's the question.
That is
Yeah.
correct. Thanks for listening,
All right.
everybody.
Bye.
Standing on my own 2 feet. No one's here to comfort me. Sorry for what I have done. Sorry that your son is gone. 7 steps and it will be my last. And start to me on my back. I turn and I look to you. I'm scared but there's nothing I can do.